Hello, everybody. Um, I would like to welcome you to the second coffee hour, Klezmer Archive Coffee Hour, on a day when we've all sprung forward and are still a little bit groggy, trying to get adjusted to a new time setting. Um, this this is a part of an ongoing series of conversations that we're having to talk about the Klezmer Archive project as we are wrapping up our first official granting period and documenting the research and the work that we did. And part of that process is to then share that work and share the progress that we've made with people in our community, such as yourselves, and to other folks who might be interested in what we're up to. So this conversation is going to be about networks. We're going to talk about the communities, the networks that we find inside the music and between the people who create the music, and how we're thinking about that. And I'm also going to talk about centering human connection in digital spaces. This has been a topic, even though it's a little bit far down the pike for us in terms of actually realizing these things. This has been very much front and center in our thinking about how we envision the archive as a digital space that also will bring people in and connect people, even though they can't be sitting in the same room with each other. So with that preface, I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to show my slides. Go into, can everybody see my
Yes, we can.
screen? Okay. Great. This is the last thing I'll say before I move on, is that this is a summary of two presentations that were given at conferences in 2022. One of them was in the Digital Humanities Conference in Budapest, Hungary in November, and then the second one was the Association for Jewish Studies conference in December. Okay, so overview, just going to give say what I'm going to talk about, a little bit of background about Klezmer Archive, and then part 2 is going to be looking at networks, and part 3 is going to be looking at centering human connection. To most of you in this room today, this will be familiar territory, but this project is creating a universally accessible, useful resource for interaction, discovery, and research on all available information about klezmer music. In addition to the items that are on the page here, I want to emphasize that we feel that while we are working on klezmer music as our center of focus, this project and the outcome of this project is intended to be adaptable for folks who are working in heritage communities of many different varieties, particularly in musics of oral tradition. But there may be possibilities for other kinds of heritage communities who are documenting themselves as community members and their community as a cultural space. So some beautiful words from Bronya Sakina, talking about the connectedness of songs and people. And this philosophy really lives at the heart of this project.
Christina, I'm not seeing you move through the slides.
Really?
Yep.
Okay. That doesn't seem like that's a good thing. So you're still on the front page then, basically. Okay, let's do this. How about we share that? Now,
there we go.
There we go. Okay. You've all seen that first slide probably before. So yeah, there's a great quote from Bronya that really captures the essence of music as the medium that connects people across generations. And then with our friend Emisha Iliafalvi, who is a wonderful folklorist in Budapest, she sort of just captures quite, bluntly the issue that one of the first issues we confronted, which is that the descriptive metadata templates describing physical objects, that is to say classical archival descriptive tools, do not favor the digital archiving of intangible heritage and orality. And so part of our work is to figure out how to create structures that will help us describe heritage cultures and oral tradition. And I took another quote from Emisha and adapted it for our purposes as well, which is that, you know, archives and digital humanities projects are oftentimes, you know, they're conceived by people in universities, in academic settings, in archival settings, and they're always focused on outreach to the public and various audiences. But we are, but there's almost always a figure of a particular researcher at the center, and those people, and that's a natural thing, but there can be a disconnect between the creators of the culture and the archivers and describers and analysts of the culture. And so we want to make sure that we're also foregrounding that while we are creating a research that is available to everyone, or many people in many disciplines, that we are also centering ourselves as creators of and consumers of klezmer music, Yiddish song, Ashkenazic dance, and Hasidic music. And so I highlighted this sentence here in underlining, saying that, you know, as we datafy, as we make data out of music and connections and these things, then we have to always remember that data is never passive. And data production is an active process in the digital paradigm. So a little bit further into the background of the Klezmer Archive team, that's our first network. The Klezmer Archive team grew out of a network of Klezmer practitioners, who have been sort of simultaneously dreaming of this project for many, many years. And so we are very, very, very fortunate that we have in this team specialists in many, many disciplines, including 3 exemplary technologists, Max, Matthew, and Dan Kandagard, who you see here. We have archivist Eleanor Bizinski. We have musicologist and computational musicology researcher Jonathan Malin, myself and Clara, as a little bit of everything. We have our fingers in lots of pots. And then in the front, right here on this picture, we also see Skylar Versteeg, who is a UX specialist. Not pictures here is Andrew Parisi, who is a logician and ontologist who joined our team in 2022. Another one of our secret weapons, our secret sauce, a magical superpower that we have, is that 80% of our team are themselves klezmer musicians. And that is really, it's hard to overstate how important that is and how unusual it is for the technologists in a project to also be deeply involved in and invested in the datification process that they are working on. Another sort of secret sauce that we have is that all of our technologists are deeply familiar with working in industry as well as in more academic research situations. And so they bring a lot of that vision of seeing their tools as products, which has its upsides and downsides, but it does have, I think, in this case, a very, it shows itself quite prominently in the work that we're doing. And by working with Skylar as a UX specialist, they have brought this concept of identifying users and community expectations into our process from the very beginning. I'm not going to read through all of these items. If you're watching this on video, I'm going to encourage you to bookmark, pause to take these in. But one of the outcomes of having a UX specialist with us from the very beginning and sort of drawing on our network right from the very beginning, we were able to do a visioning exercise about the Klezmer Archive project that resulted in defining 9 core principles that have guided this project right from the very beginning. And we are still working on these. We're still trying to keep these ideas front and center as we move into the later stages of the Klezmer Archive project. And we're also trying to bring these ideas into other spaces at the Klezmer Institute. So open, accessible, outreach, quality analysis, and then moving on to the next page, that this should become an authoritative reference, and we want to be able to present material in an organized fashion that is also standardized, has deep and rich metadata attribution, and and very importantly is curated. Curated so that it's not just a mishmash that's impossible to navigate, and that has editorial standards that we will be working to meet as a community and as a project. So another important thing to talk about as a background is that this digital archive, Klezmer Archive, is not intended to be a place that holds physical objects. Rather, we will be describing music itself as the primary artifact and linking out to places where those objects can be found, either in physical repositories such as the Mayrand collection at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, or in digital spaces such as on YouTube, and other sort of digital repositories. And then of course, there's places that have CDs, 78s, gramophone recordings, and so on. Another core concept that we're documenting are the people and the networks of connections as performers and between performers, and so on. Okay, part 2. Any questions before I move on? I can't see everybody. Okay.
Pardon me for catching up in a minute. I wanted to offer, first of all, I'm delighted with all the stuff that you're doing. One of the things that I've worked on in doing document management and legal practice is that the discovery of information often is helped by following the steps that other people have taken as they work through an archive. And I think about the tools on Amazon and such that say popular searches or people like you have been somewhere. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's an important thing to be able to gather, because no matter how good the metadata structure might be, the process of thinking doesn't necessarily fit within the confines of any particular metadata structure.
Totally. Yes.
And following the thought process, and often it's important to know who is doing it. So the connections that you make, I'll use the law practice example again. You're looking up for a particular kind of document, but what you really want to know is who has been working on that kind of document, and how can you pick their brain or connect to their work to help you grow in what you're trying to do. And I think some kind of function built into this that has that kind of character, or is another layer or another way to promote the community of it, could be very helpful.
That is really, really cool, Bob. Thank you for sharing that. That is, I'm going to make I'm going to try to remember to make a note of that.
Yeah, What's that? I could write that up as a method.
Oh, please do. Yeah. That would be great if you wanted to forward that as an email or some other sort of ping us as a note. I can say that Matthew Stein, Dan Kundathagard, and Max, as sort of the core technologists in the team, are almost to the point of obsession of making sure, they want validation and tracking on all of those things. We talk about mostly in the editorial process, but I think that taking that into the who is looking at what when as a way to build out sort of adjacent search and things like that that's great. And I know that they're familiar with the tools in Amazon Web Services and so forth that facilitate those kinds of information gathering. So I'm going to ask you to that would be great if you wanted to help write that up, and also hold that thought, because we're going to talk about stuff to do with search in a little bit in the third part of the presentation. So
didn't want to lose it while it was on my mind.
No, it's perfect. And please, everybody who's here, hi Marty, jump in. When I'm in presenter mode, I can't see if you're jumping up and down and waving your arms. So just punch in or Clara, or wave and Clara will jump in. Okay, so let's go back here. Yeah, okay, great. So, awesome. So networks. So, once again, for most of you in the room here, these will be very familiar to you, but I think it's worth naming them. And it has been worthwhile for us to name these ideas as we are working through what we're trying to do and how we're trying to do it. Anna Rogers has been a guide star. She's been a touchstone for the Klezmer Archive project through the Kisselhoff-Magnevetsky project. And she is the person who went and retrieved the material from the Bernetsky National Library, collaboration with Pete Reshevsky and Walter Zev Feldman and others. But she wrote this beautiful paragraph about this material and about the project. And she really highlights in it the connection between the musicians of the past who gave their materials to Ansky or who shared tunes with Beregovsky, and the musicians and researchers and participants today who are invested in Ashkenazic expressive culture. And so we think about human connections, in the present, mentorships, bandmates, family connections, in the present, but also in the past. And these are things that we're working to document. Clara has done a lot of work on thinking about this. We are looking at knowledge carried by individuals about networks, right? And how we can think about, capture, and respectfully document those things. And then we're looking at networks that are embedded in the music itself. And that got into some really interesting spaces. Jonathan Malin was the lead author on an article for the Klezmer transactions in the Music Information Retrieval Journal. And he's talking here about this concept of the total social fact, which is to say that documentation of klezmer music, absent the human beings who perform, carry, and transmit that music, is not a complete picture. And so, as an example of this, we think about, well, how do we represent the influence of a musician who has a very deep, who teaches a lot, but does not have a deep catalog of recordings or performances, so that somebody from the outside might look at that person and not see what a profound influence they have within the community. And we want to make sure that our archival tools are able to represent that influence. And some more examples are, mentorship and teaching, bandmates, session collaborators, people who play together on bandstands together, family connections, of course, and then going into more abstract places like non-direct stylistic influences. For example, you might have somebody who is a contemporary player, but who is deeply really a student of Schlemke Beckerman, for example, as opposed to a terrace person. We have researchers and performers and documentarians and interlocutors, and those are all kind of dyads and triads and multiplicities of relationships that we're looking about documenting and thinking about. So, some of the challenges in our corpus and in our work is that, particularly in the past, we are dealing, and especially with the Kisselhoff-Magnevetsky project, we're dealing with people who are mostly not famous and who had very localized spheres of influence. And so speaking in digital spaces, our automated ingestion can be very, very difficult to train, because our work is very bespoke. It's very handwritten music. It's not just text, but text in multiple alphabets, multiple orthographies. We have handwritten music, also very difficult to train for automated processes. So of necessity, a lot of our work will be quite handmade. And on many of you will who have worked with the Kisselhoff project will recognize these, music manuscripts. And this is true of many, many, many kinds of projects, but I'm just sort of citing our particular challenges. Is we have, music manuscripts with marginalia, we have ideas about Jewish music in Yizkor memorial books and other memoir material. Sometimes we have field notes and catalogs. Sometimes we have field recordings. In fact, Clara works with Michael Alpert collection, huge collection of field recordings, liner notes, commercial recordings, concert programs, and et cetera, et cetera. So first of all is sort of documenting human networks sort of as performers, teachers, and et cetera. And then now we have this lovely quote from Ilya Schneeves talking about interest area knowledge networks. And this is when we find people who are brought together who share an interest in a particular topic and who share information freely. And our classic location that will be familiar to many of you is this idea of these epic Facebook threads that happen where, and this one is a particularly rich one, but I think we can all think of examples of these things where we have lots of people chiming in about a question with examples and thoughts and comments on comments. And, these are amazing discussions, but since Facebook is not really built to capture these discussions, like it's quite ephemeral and they can be very, very hard to track down after they've slipped down the timeline. And so this particular thread had 43 relevant comments, 13 different people commenting, all kinds of formats, all kinds of tunes were brought to bear. Yeah, and I'm going to leave that one there. And then a third concept is this idea of klezmer music itself as a network. And that is where we're talking about social implications. We're talking about documenting and thinking through what the music itself carries that gives us information about networks of people, about communities, about geography, and about time. And so the dream of the Klezmer Archive project and of this tool is to be able to do computational analysis on large corpora of klezmer and klezmer related music so that we can observe trends above and beyond what we can see in individual tunes. Now, hopefully our tool will also highlight individual tunes as tune families and adjacent tunes that will help to lift up those kinds of connections, but we're also looking at the concept of doing larger scale computational analysis. So as a great example of this is returns to this Facebook topic, and this is a sort of a graphic representation of the relationships that were talked about in that thread. Some of which are all related to each other and some of which are separate complementary examples. And so Chas and Senim was the first, was the sort of example, and it was discovered that it shares parts with Turk America, and Üsküdar shares parts with Turk America, but Üsküdar and Chas and Senim, for example, do not share parts with each other. This question mark represents a concept that was brought up and then rejected by the discussion group. And then over here, we have two other exemplars of sort of these modular tunes that are made of parts of other tunes. And here we have an example from the Budowitz ensemble of a explicitly composed tune that took two parts from the Bugic Hora Moldoveneska and Shah de Rebbe Tanzt, and created a new composition out of it that we could call a modular tune. And it has become such of its own identity that the composition process of that is completely invisible. If you go to the internet right now and look for Bugic Felix, it's attributed to all kinds of different things. It's hard to sort of surface where it came from, and that compositional process that was uncovered and discussed in detail on that Facebook thread. And so when we're talking about becoming an authoritative resource, we want to be able to, I mean, there's limits to what any project would be able to do, but the idea is that we will be able to start showing and revealing those connections in a much more visible way. So I'm going to move on to part 3. But before I do, I want to stop for questions if there's anybody. Hi, Noam. Nice to see you. Does anybody have any questions or comments or thoughts before we move on to the next section? Okay.
Well, I'm kind of pleased to see that modularity has come into the Klezmer discourse so prominently, because I thought it was really important to do. But I'm always interested in being comparativist, and so I think it should be compared to Irish practice, and where you have modular tunes, and it should never. This always looks too isolated in a way,
How do you? Can you explain a little bit more about isolated?
I mean, it said, well, this is the way this klezmer world works, but it's not. It's the way European folk music works, or something like that.
Is to be more
comparativist. Yeah, it might be the way Afghan folk tunes work. I think the importance of what we do is to exactly enter the wider discourse, because nobody's ever heard of this music. Nobody in European folklore studies knows about this. Whatever we're doing is not going to reach them, and they have all their own discourses that they've been doing for a couple of hundred years, in some cases, or certainly decades worth. I'm just always urging us to not be provincial, but I think it's in our own best interests to be able to join, larger conversations about issues about tonality, modularity, roles of musicians within communities. I mean, everything we're talking about is absolutely commonplace across large stretches of Eurasia. But you'd never know that in the klezmer literature, which tends to be very, a little bit too enclosed for my taste.
Great. Well, I will take that stamp of approval for the directions that we're heading in, and thank you for explaining a little bit more about that. I think that the Kisselhoff corpus, the Kisselhoff corpus and Makonovetsky's manuscript, really, they don't allow us to stay in a provincial, isolated place. They do not permit that, because they are so deeply integrated. Like there's a Frelix and a Dobranach right next to a mazurka and a polonaise, and they're all integrated together in what maybe this is a stretch, but when I have a notebook and I have these things all close to each other, like that means that to me that that they're in my head in similar spaces.
Yeah, but that fascinating Facebook page on that one tune, I mean, it looks a little like the endless discussion of Uskudar as a piece in the whole film that was made about that, and who does it belong to, and but do any of those people who are doing that have a clue that there's an intense discussion going on in this little world? No. I mean, so how does one make this part of it and show that it's actually an important contribution to a much broader storyline?
Cool. Yeah, we are definitely thinking about that. So that's great. Okay. Anybody else before we move on? Okay, cool. So I apologize. I sort of galloped through those first 2 sections, because I think that this third section is really great, and hopefully we'll have to find some things that we want to talk about here. So this centering human connection was the core of the Association for Jewish Studies conference presentation. And we have this lovely quote from Jordan Hirsch, who talks about, some of the work we do is quite isolated and lonely. We digitize tunes together, but, we're, as the Kisselhoff project is trying to create spaces where we can work together and talk together, and eventually to play together and celebrate this connection to this music. So I've got four main topics here. When we're now talking about, we're going to pretend like the Klezmer archive already exists or is in imminence and imminently going to exist. And so some of the questions that we're thinking about as we get to that place are, how do we facilitate access to reference archivists and librarians when you don't have a building to walk into, right? How do we design for serendipitous discovery, that joy that you get by walking down the stacks and just looking at a section of the shelf and saying, oh, that looks interesting, and pulling it down. How do we create virtual reading rooms or the coffee shop next to the library? And then how do we joyously collect and share community knowledge? And I'll get to why I put joyously there in a minute. So Judy Pinellas gave, I did some interviews with a bunch of music librarians and archival space librarians, and Judy Pinellas came up with this quite brilliant quote, that summarizes the whole problem. The Google search bar cannot tell you what you want, right? But a human person, who has experience and has knowledge and who knows their collections, is definitely going to be able to help you figure out what is your question when maybe you don't quite have an idea of what that question is. And that seems, this can be fairly obvious, right? But it's at the same time, it remains true, and it's completely profound. And so, how do you access people in digital spaces? This is not an unsolved or unsolvable problem. In the pandemic, when libraries were closed, people like Judy Pinellas and Amanda Miriam-Siegel and Mila Sholchova interacted with users from all over, as students and with visitors from all over the world who were looking to access things in various ways. And so you can set up private conversations and other ways that you can really connect directly with somebody who has knowledge about the archival tool. And then another thing that sort of it's a little bit part of this is to create what we call onboarding scenarios for newcomers. And that's to do with, showing people how to use the tool and sort of exhibiting the resources that are available within this tool. So you have like your FAQ, how-tos and facts that answer sort of basic questions. And then when it comes to like actual research questions and how to formulate questions, then you're going to be passed on to the opportunity to interact with a human specialist person. And then another key thing that we've been thinking about is serendipitous search, and a term that's been called generous interfaces. And a great leader in this relatively recently invented field is a guy named Mike Mitchell-Whitelaw, who is an Australian researcher who has done a lot of work on this. And the Europeana archival space is also thinking about these things quite deeply. And I can share some resources on this after our talk. But Whitelaw's, one of the great quotes from Whitelaw is that he sort of says, and we all know this, people like to look, not to search, right? In digital spaces, this concept of delight has to be transformed from tactile to visual when we're in a digital space. And that successful interfaces engage curiosity. And it's always essential to remember that different kinds of users need different pathways. And so our user experience research and mental mapping work that we are doing is intended to help us understand how different kinds of users, what their needs will be as they come to the Klezmer archive tool. And so just to illustrate the difference between search and browse, this is an image from the Macaulay Library of Ornithology at Cornell. And, like many places, you go to the website and there it is. There's the search bar and you are invited to enter the species name. And and if you know a species name, you might enter it. And so for specialists and people who want to get directly to information about a specific thing, that's great, right there, right up front. But what if you're maybe like me and I don't really know any species names other than crow and dove and bald eagle. But I'm curious to know more about things that maybe I don't know about. Then we have something like this, which is an interface created by White Law that gives us now a bunch of this is information extracted from the metadata in the Cornell lab and what it connects to. So then I can browse through alphabetically. And then if I see a name that I like, I can click on it and then I can see images of that particular bird and I can hear that bird sound. And so, the difference between browsing and searching, it's everything, right? But you need both, obviously, right? But it's important to remember that browsing can be a great way to engage curiosity and to facilitate discovery, which is and delight, and the delight of finding something that you didn't know existed. Another great experiment that we've looked at is called An Ocean of Books. And this is an experiment that is a visual display of novels and various kinds of books. And they were linked together in proximity, depending on their mentions, the proximity to each other in mentions on the internet. And so Stephen King and Alice Walker, oddly, have a quite tight connection in this particular experiment. And Stephen King and Leo Tolstoy have, surprisingly, an unexpected tight research. When I go out of this PowerPoint, we'll go to some of these links and we can look at them more closely. And then there's this great art emotions map Google experiment that is cute. It's nice in a static image, but it's even cooler in person, and I'll show you why in a few minutes. And then here's another great project that was inspired by work and done in collaboration with Mitchell Whitlaw, which is to take, put the images up front so that you are engaged so that you still have the opportunity to look for a person by name or other characteristics, but you can also just browse the images and find your own pathway through the project. So we're going to return to that topic at the end of our talk as we can sort of skate through some of those places in a little bit more of an interactive way. But the third topic from the slide before is how to create informal gathering spaces. And, are there ways to create that Facebook thread, that sort of intimacy of an asynchronous conversation, right? Which is what Facebook threads are often. You go and maybe 2 days later you add your comment. You don't necessarily have to be exactly in the same room, although sometimes you are. But we want to try to think creatively about how to recreate and create the feel of a reading room online, in an online space, and how to create informal environments that can flatten the distance between teachers and students, elders and youngsters, and just basically anybody who might find themselves in a space and might strike up a conversation, because discussion is, of course, provocative and inspirational, right? And we can oftentimes just share a lot of information quickly and informally in a way that is more challenging if we have to write it down. So let's see. Yeah, and I have this image of this Facebook thread as the online version of a coffee shop in some ways. And then the last one here is we're thinking about how we can joyously collect and share community knowledge. And that's about making the things that we do engaging and fun. And so, documenting community, what we've experienced in the Kisselhoff Makinovetsky project is that documenting community or documenting the music and the text is in itself a kind of a community building exercise that has been able to bring people together from many different spaces. I'm mindful of Dan Karkner, who's here, and Judith Nemtanu, who from Bordeaux, France, who ended up working together and having some deep conversations about various aspects of the Makinovetsky collection and some of the big showpieces. And those connections spring up spontaneously simply by being in spaces and rooms together. So we think about events that are fun. We haven't done gamification, but this is a thing that happens in a lot of crowdsourcing projects. But for us has always been trying to think through what are direct benefits that we can give back to people who donate their time and energy to help us sort of work on this bigger project. We take it as a value to build for everyone to the extent that we can, to build for everybody to welcome anybody who comes in and to reduce barriers to entry. And then the last topic here is the idea of curating and valuing commentary by experts and practitioners. This is, if you think about Reddit and the ability to upvote things, that works in a particular way, but I think we're envisioning a slightly more curated and editorial process by which we can sort of really make sure that we allow commentary by anyone who wants to contribute and add to information about a particular item, but that we're also very much highlighting and valuing the folks who are deeply experienced and experts and who are the sages of our corner of the universe, of the musical universe. And that's pretty much it. I think I'm gonna, oh yeah. I left some slides in there. So that's pretty much the end of the explicit sort of PowerPoint part of it. And if you want, we can go look at some of these other websites. Or we can also just hang out and chat and ask and do some questions. Bob, you look like you've got something.
Yeah, no, I want to throw out a cross-fertilization from some other reading that I've been doing.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a book out last year called An Immense World by Ed Yong, Y-O-N-G, which I happened to listen to as a audiobook, which was an interesting experience because he conveys his enthusiasm for the material. But the connection I'm trying to make is as the different ways different participants see and substitute for see experience in a variety of dimensions, and people in Jung's book Other Creatures have very different experiences based on the perceptual tools they have and the training experience, socialization, and such. And the term for that whole experiential concept, ecosystem, is Umwelt. It's a German word that captures this whole perceptual constellation. And Jung explores how that works in all sorts of organisms and all sorts of perceptual mechanisms. A radical example is that there are many species that can see with 4 colors receptors. And we can't reproduce as human beings the experience of seeing with 4 color receptors because we only have 3. But I think that there's something somewhat analogous in the way that we come to this experience that we're talking about here, that the different participants, the different training capabilities and stuff, not merely changes the classification, but it changes the experience in this highly connected way. Mm-hmm. And while it's not a direct connection, but I think it sort of opens up ways of thinking about it that break out of the box. You know, the example of electric fish being able to detect food in the murky depths because they detect electrical fields and they see with the electrical fields. And it's instantaneous because in an electrically conductive environment, you have instantaneous field. I think, you know, I think about a workshop session. Now let's go to one of our Klezmer workshop sessions, and how the different what each of us bring to that and how we experience it differently. And so I'd like to see how we can somehow bring some of that kind of thinking. And it's one of the ways out of what I'll call the trap of classification.
Yes. Totally.
It demonstrates really that that the human mind, and for that matter, organisms in the more general, are capable of dealing with their experience in multiple simultaneous dimensions, and
Totally.
multiple simultaneous interacting dimensions. And that's one, you know, you say, well, what's the joy of the reading room?
Totally.
It's because you have this interaction that's happening in a multidimensional way. So
Totally. I love that so much. I want to, like,
well, that's why we're recording this, right? Well, we'll get to work with the transcript.
right. But like, you know, and so this that I'm showing, so remember when I was like showing there was a static image of the art emotions map, and immediately this one, when it's live on the website, is like so much more interesting because it moves, it jiggles, and like that, somebody thought to make it jiggle like that, and I have to say that I love it, right? And there's all of these words that are paired here, and the experiment was, I think that 1,500 people were asked to look at certain numbers of pieces of artwork and then to add words to come up with emotion words to pair with them. And so this image, this graphic representation is about art, but you could imagine, and I could imagine, and I would love to see that there was a similar kind of map like this that could be about klezmer music. Like, why not? We have classifications for various dance genres and other things, and those are, you know, can be extremely useful. But this idea of, you know, admiration and absorbing and sensual desire and wonder and awe and elegant and intimate connectedness, these are all words that we can use to think about klezmer tunes, you know, that are maybe different maybe than lively and vibrant, right? And so so I'm going to just click on a random image, and you can see here that this image was coded by the people who viewed it as calm and serene, elegant, dreamy, whimsical. And what a lovely way to imagine coming to, you wanted to put together a klezmer program, and you could put your program together, for example, by finding tunes that had characteristics like this, as opposed to looking for a Skochna and a Frelix and a Jock and a so like this. Or you could, you know, you could potentially, I mean, the dream would be to be able to search on all of those kinds of things, right? And I think like that speaks to what I'm hearing you say, Bob, about perceiving things with different kinds of senses, you know, and creating those tags. I mean, we're talking about the ability. This is inspired by another project in Australia called the Honey Network, where individuals can create their own typologies, right? Bob, you could be a user of the Klezmer archive and you could make a collection of Bob's favorite tunes. And the only characteristic they need to share with each other is that you choose to put them in a collection, you know? We could create an experiment where people would be invited to add emotional tags to some kind of corpus of tunes or something like that. So I'm going to ask you, Bob, does this get at some of the things that you're thinking about?
No, it's definitely related. The need for multidimensionality is really important. I mean, I
Yeah.
think you see how flat that image feels compared to the way you think. And
Mhm.
you know, the mathematics behind natural language processing that drives so-called artificial intelligence, and a term I prefer not to use, says where you look for connectedness of content in a multi-dimensional space that has to be represented by mathematics that, you know, our champions are capable of doing and the rest of us barely. But one way to think of it is that materials group into the valleys in that space based on their connectedness measured by something or other. And an example that sort of relates to what we're doing that comes out of that, it comes out of the publicity around Chat GPI and the New York Times columnist, where the Bing AI fell in love with him and insisted that
And then told him that his wife was like horrible and he should
so I looked up. IBM Watson published an example of how they characterize the tone of materials, and there were like 5 factors: joy, disgust, you know, and if others quite not as extreme. And humans trained the search mechanism on sample text. And what the natural language processing does is then goes after a large body of text, like all of Wikipedia or all of Bing image. Well, not quite, but lots, and compares it. And when there are matches, then it assigns to the search item the characteristics that were in the sample. And that's how you fall in love with your AI, right? Or it falls in love with you. What strikes me, and I think we have to deal with, is that reduction to a handful of factors, however liberating it seems that you can do 6 factors instead of 2 or 3,
Totally.
is really constricting on thought, and that's part of what human beings working with each other do in ways that are far more flexible, even though the computational version of it feels like, oh, that you recognize something going on in there. That's why Chat GPT looks like there's a sentient something or other working, because we humans apply pattern to things that aren't necessarily generated by anything like a sentient being. And then again, all sorts of things that we don't think of normally as sentient creatures can do pattern recognition and do it really well. Sometimes a lot better than we can. Go try to echolocate by yourself. You know.
Yeah. What and I think this. So I listened to that Hard Fork podcast where the guy was describing his interaction with Bing, but it's to sort of refine your concept. It's like a non-sentient entity saying or, you know, repeating words that were created by sentient humans, like you know, like if it's trained on this natural language, you know, of love stories and poems and all these things, but then it's interpreted by this non-sentient entity. Like, we shouldn't really be surprised when utter chaos ensues.
Right. But to come all the way back to us, I think that we need to mix our capabilities. I've described these computational tools as an exoskeleton. It's if you think of one of the Marvel superheroes, amplifying their capability because they are in an exoskeleton that lets them hit something with super force, right? But there's still a human inside it.
Totally.
And I think that if we understand these tools that we're using as our intellectual exoskeletons that amplify what we can do by ourselves, then we have a place for them, and we say it's the reeds in your accordion were handcrafted, or they were machined, or in the case of a part in my clarinet, 3D printed.
Right.
So there's I think that's a spirit that we can bring to all of this. That is a way of marrying the technologists and the computational experts with the, pardon the expression, humanistic.
Yeah, no, that's totally where it lives. And in fact, I'm going to share screen again, and I want to talk. I skipped over this last slide, and I want to bring it back up, because I think what you're talking about sort of summarizes. It really puts a finger on and shines a light on something that I hadn't thought about it in that way, but which is quite profound. And I'm going to sort of I want to bring in one more idea, which is that I sort of talked about at the beginning. Well, I talked at the beginning and the end. But Anna Rogers was insistent that the Kisselhoff material be released to everyone all at once, right from the very beginning, right? She had no patience for the idea that somebody would take it and work on it for another 20 years, and then maybe they would, write a book or do something. And so she pushed us in no uncertain terms into this radically open space. And through that process, we've come to realize that the only way that really makes sense to work with this material is by many hands. Like, it requires, there's so much material there, there's so much there to see, observe, that it really does require many people to be involved in working with and interpreting and sharing the load and the joy of and the crunchiness of working on it. And so then we get into this these ideas of making sure that your feedback loops are there, that there's that for people who invest in your project and share them with you your time and energy, that there's something that they get back in return that can be in many dimensions. It can be a sense of community, it can be a PDF of music, it can be a recording, it can be all kinds of things. And you're right that the technology is the skin there. But taking that model, like the work of the Klezmer archive can never be completed by one person, right? It is a project that is bigger than any one of us in this room, or even our team of 10 people, or even, everybody on our mailing list, or, think bigger and bigger. I mean, it can only be done by us together. And so we encountered this, thanks, Noam. We encountered this great project. I spoke about it, the Honey Project, in a honey project in Australia, and they have this this quote here in their in a paper where they talk about the project. And they're just saying that honey has been designed to support the underlying precepts of humanities research, especially complexity, contestation, and connection. Multiple interpretations of relationships, including conflicting ones, can be represented. Connections do not have to be right, so-called, or quote, authoritative, or even logical. And user-generated links can be as creative and complex and nuanced and contrary as the multitude of honey users themselves. Honey also enables and indeed actively encourages other users to contest these links and provide alternative interpretations of how entities in the graph are connected. So I think this speaks very deeply to what you're talking about, Bob, in terms of like building the you have to be thinking about your audiences, and you have to be thinking about your goals as you build your technology. And I think if that's a takeaway from this, the work that we've been doing with the Klezmer Archive is trying to understand the expanse, the intellectual expanse that our tool needs to incorporate into its technical DNA. And of course, you know, we have this model. The model exists, right? And it exists in this beautiful printed form that has been with Judaism for, you know, millennia. So that, I think that's kind of what it's all about here, you know.
You know, you can't, the other thing is you can't talk about Talmud without talking about the Talmud Chacham. I mean, that is, the Talmud is a living tool because of the way that people interact with it. And because of the way it captures these conversations across time and allows, encourages, promotes this very intricate discussion that literally you know, dissects the text and makes very active association now that has been derided as Talmudic thinking in the negative sense, as being very narrow and contained, and but it's also expansive in the ways that we're describing. So I just encourage us every time we see a page of Talmud to think about the people and the activity behind it, and not just that it's somehow some sort of static text. I mean, it's the magic of a conversation where you say somebody in the 3rd century is having a conversation with somebody in the 3rd century BCE, and that they're all present in some way or another as we're reading them in the 21st century CE. You know, trying to be careful, or whatever century we're in. So.
Absolutely. Clara, did you have something that you wanted to see? I see you popped up.
I was looking for I'm looking for that blog post that we discovered at the retreat, and seeing I have the sense that there was a really great quote in that directly relating to this, and so
okay,
I don't have it
blog
yet.
Post by who? Like
you remember? It was called the Talmud blog, and it's about this.
Oh yeah, that dude. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyways, I'll come back to you if I find what I'm thinking of.
It's somewhere in the notes from the December retreat. I want to read something that we just discovered about speaking to this sort of Talmudic and Torah discussion, is that the team has sort of been captured by this book, The Jewish Dark Continent, which came out relatively recently. This is Nathaniel Deutsch translating Ansky. Yes, great. So Noam, you'll be familiar with this. And we just got turned on to it because we both just ordered it. But for those of you who are not so familiar, I'm just going to quote a little bit from page 34. Ansky is articulating that, Deutsch is quoting Ansky here, and he says that, yet on par with the book, with the great written Torah that we have received as an inheritance from hundreds of chosen generations, pious sages and great scholars, thinkers and spiritual guides, we possess yet another Torah, an oral Torah. The people themselves, especially the common folk, have created this Torah without interruption during their long, hard, and tragic history. This oral Torah, which consists of folk tales and legends, parables, aphorisms, songs and melodies, traditions, habits, beliefs, and so on, is also an enormously significant product of the same Jewish spirit that created the written Torah. It reflects the same beauty and purity of the Jewish soul, the gentleness and nobility of the Jewish heart, and the height and depth of Jewish thought. You know, so Zev Feldman was commenting that, Ansky has not been directly translated very much into English until relatively recently. So reading this for us was a revelation, because we've been talking around these concepts for a long time. And then Deutsch goes on to say that Ansky imagined that the Jews of his own day and of future generations would devote themselves to collecting, studying, and creatively reappropriating the oral Torah of the, quote, common folk. Instead of only a scholarly elite, Ansky hoped that Jews of all backgrounds would become amateur ethnographers or Sammlers, literally collectors, a dream that Ansky himself tried to bring to fruition. So, being able to sort of situate ourselves in that stream with a thinker like Ansky has been really powerful for us, to feel like we're definitely like on the right track.